Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Mob Museum. My name is Jeff Schumacher, and I'm the Vice President of Exhibits and Programs here. Want to welcome our in-person audience as well as our online audience. We expect that we'll have a good turnout online as well, so welcome to the Mob Museum virtually. We are pleased to present the second panel discussion in a series of 3 that we are calling The Future of Policing. Our first panel in August explored the culture of policing. Tonight's panel will look at the history of race and policing, and our October panel will delve into legislative reforms in advance of the Nevada legislature meeting. Before we get started, I need to remind everyone to please wear your masks throughout the program. You may not have to do that at home, but we do need to do that here in the museum. Obviously, if you have a drink or a snack, you can adjust accordingly. But our number one goal tonight, as always, is to maintain a safe and healthy environment for everyone to enjoy the presentation. After the panel discussion concludes, we'll have a microphone available, this one, and we'll take some of your questions. I'll come around and let you ask questions. I want to emphasize that we're interested in questions, not speeches or statements. Everyone's here tonight to listen to the thoughts and perspectives of our panelists. So let's please respect that. Okay, now I would like to turn over the proceedings to my colleague, Shakayla Alvaranga, who will moderate tonight's discussion. Shakayla?
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you all for being here and taking part in this important discussion. And I know we have quite a few people on our live stream as well. Again, my name is Shakayla. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the museum. Our goal with this series, The Future of Policing, has always been to have a meaningful discussion about police use of force. And in order to do that, we must address the foundational ideologies that have shaped our current police practice, and we must recognize that this conversation is not solely about police brutality. Not only will understanding the history of policing help us to appreciate how police forces have changed over time, but it will also help us to more fully comprehend what led up to this point in history. It's imperative that we have these discussions as a community so we can recognize and solve these kinds of problems together. We have a remarkable group of people who will guide us through tonight's conversation, Race and Policing in America, a History of Conflict. And with that being said, I'd like to introduce our panelist for this evening. So joining us on the far right via video conference is Gloria Brown Marshall. She is a professor of constitutional law at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And then we have Tyler Perry. He is an assistant professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at UNLV. Clady White, the director of Oral History Research Center at UNLV Libraries. And right to my right, Mr. Greg McCurdy, retired assistant sheriff at Las Vegas Metro Police Department. So I'd like to begin this conversation by starting from the beginning. So formal police systems, they're actually a pretty recent phenomenon. There were hundreds of years of human history during which police departments actually didn't exist. So for more on what this kind of system looked like and the first force, let's turn to Mr. Tyler Perry.
Yes, so thank you very much, Shakayla, for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak. I think when we talk about police in the United States, there's a narrative that I think tends to homogenize the police's entire entity, whereas I think maybe even the officers can speak to this more than I can. Each county and locality kind of determines its own structure for a police force. And if we look at the origins of the way that police units were developed within the United States, there's really 2 reference points that we can point to explain how the police as a professional institution was developed in the United States. Because as mentioned, this is a relatively new phenomenon in not just US history, but world history in general. And oftentimes people cite the slave patrols as one of the primary reference points within the United States. And that is a large piece to the story, but just as individual police units have their own laws and codes in which they follow, the earliest sources of the slave patrols that were developed in first the colonies and then the United States was in about 1703 or 1704, depending upon the source that you read, in South Carolina, which was in direct response to the rising population of enslaved people of African descent in that colony. So it was not necessarily a response to heightened crime. There was no crime wave going on within colonial America at that point. It was used as an organized law enforcement entity, which is what the historian Sally Haddon calls them, a law enforcement entity, to control, surveil, and subordinate the population of African descent because they were perceived to be guilty. And they were perceived to be guilty because there was always the possibility that if the numbers swelled, overwhelming the white population, that could foment slave insurrection or rebellion. So the slave patrols were developed and organized first in South Carolina and then proliferated everywhere, so that by the time of the American Revolution, any state that still had slavery as an institution, mainly in the South, but also in the North a little bit too, they had some form of slave patrolling and slave patrols. Now, again, each state was different, but the one commonality that all of them shared is it was typically lower class white men who were seeking some form of power within the southern United States at that time. And if you look at the narratives of formerly enslaved people, they would often talk this way in that these were just poor white men who wanted to beat up somebody that was black. And so if we look at the slave patrols as one origin point of law enforcement, or an official organized law enforcement, that does explain at least one piece of the story for how the police, as we understand them in the United States, were formed. The other piece, and I'll be relatively brief so other panelists can talk, is the way that the units of law enforcement organized in the North or in the Midwest were slightly different, but had a similar function in that many of them were organized as a response to increased immigration, particularly immigration of people that were considered othered populations, Catholic immigrants, Irish, Eastern Europeans. And this was a form of nativism that was instituted by individual city and state governments as a way to enforce the law and to intimidate the immigrant populations into conformity. Now, eventually, populations like the Irish will become the police force. But one thing that we find is that the common experience, historically speaking, is that law enforcement entities, before the professionalization of the police department, were strictly organized under the presumption that you had to control and subordinate marginalized people. In the South, it was enslaved people of African descent, but also free people of color. And in the North and in the Midwest, it was immigrant groups from Europe that were perceived to not be white enough.
Tyler, thank you. And let's also talk briefly about the Southern Black Codes in 1865, because this starts to really reinforce a systemic structure of inequality in America, at least when it came to laws. Clady?
So, Black codes, though, were those codes to keep African Americans in their place. So codes were put in force at the end of slavery when blacks signed labor contracts. So that's the most important reason for those black codes that started at that point in history. And if you refuse to sign a labor contract, then you could be forced to do so with imprisonment. So we know at that time that we see African Americans being picked up for vagrancy, and it meant that if you were picked up for vagrancy, then you didn't need a labor contract. They would just put you in prison, and then they could use your labor as they saw fit. So they could loan you out to a plantation. But those codes were put in place because of labor. And the labor was needed, of course, because slavery was over by that point. And I just want to piggyback on everything about the slave patrols. You said everything. And I just want you to think about the most populous state at that time that had the black majority, there's even a book called Black Majority, it was South Carolina. So it made sense that started, those kind of patrols, 1704, started in South Carolina. So it makes sense that it would have been that way.
Thank you. So this brings us to two crucial topics, the Jim Crow laws and the war on drugs as well. So before we bring Mr. Greg McCurdy in here, Gloria Brown-Marshall, can you explain the Jim Crow laws, what it is, and how these laws still affect communities of color today?
Thank you, and good evening. I'm in New York City, and so it's a little later here, but I will wanted first, if I could, just supplement things that were said by my colleagues. One, I would actually include an earlier time period for the type of law enforcement that was taking place. And the reason why I include that is because we know that the Virginia colony is where we start the foundation of this country, and that was founded in 1607. In 1619, we had the arrival of 20 Africans. So many people might have followed the 1619 Project in the New York Times, but that arrival of those Africans then gave us this diversity. So we had the English, we had the Dutch, we had the Scots, and now we Africans within a 20-year period of the creation of the Virginia colony, which is the first permanent English colony. That's why we speak English today. And it's during that time period, we also had indentured servants. And so these indentured servants would run away because they were working, they were called many times white slaves, and they would run away, and you would have, because they were treated cruelly and weren't paid, but they worked on the contract as laborers to pay their way for coming over here. And we would have also these Africans. And the thought is, what was the legal status of these Africans? But I want you to know about Mary and Anthony Johnson. And Mary and Anthony Johnson were Africans in that Virginia colony who not only had servants of their own, but they had white and black servants of their own. These Africans did in the 1600s. And so when we look at the criminal justice system, we have to look at it as a system that was developed very early on in that part of American history. But what was now the consequence for those indentured servants who ran away? And that's why I take the time back, because when the case of John Punch, an African who's an indentured servant who runs away with two European indentured servants, and they're caught and brought back, but who caught them? So we have to include the bounty hunters, because these people who were the laborers who ran away and the owners of these people, of their indenturement contracts, wanted them back, they would use bounty hunters. So I would include bounty hunters into that type of policing. I would also include those people who were working in the colonies at the time, who were maintaining the laws that would also be included in what I would consider law enforcement. And the case of John Punch, the African, received a lifelong prison sentence, a lifelong sentence of expanded punishment, I should say. They received an expansion of their indenturement contract, and we began to see as early as 1670 what we now see as the difference in treatment between the European and the African. And when we talk about vestiges, and we needed vestiges of the Black codes we're living with today, they go all the way back to the 1600s. And I'll give you another example. The laws that were created in 1619, the House of Burgesses, which was a legislative body that was created the same year the Africans arrived, a month before they arrived in July, we created the House of Burgesses, a representative body. But we start to see the difference in the application of the laws early on. By 1669, a law is passed that says it is not a felony to kill an African. And so we're talking about a European killing an African. It is not going to be a felony. And so by 1869, you begin to see the impunity that's being used with the killing of an African, and the raping of African women is not considered a crime, but the raping of a white woman is. And the children of that assault do not inherit from the European father. then you start to see the difference in the way of treatment in the legal system. So when we go forward with the Black codes, we need to look at the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but it abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime. And so when you read the 13th Amendment, as my colleagues have said, it triggers now mass incarceration because they need this labor that's lost from slavery ending in 13th Amendment, 1865, and they're trying to recreate that labor. And so as we go through the Black codes, the laws that say that people who are looking for their children who have been sold away are now loitering. They're now trespassing. They're creating criminal laws just for Black people. And that's what the same thing we see today is the creation of criminalization of Black behavior, so that what a white person could do is not considered a crime. Or if it is, you might say to that young person, when you have a future ahead of you, I'm not going to put you in juvenile detention. I'm not going to arrest you because that's going to give you a record, where you're not going to see the same type of behaviors from law enforcement consistently when it comes to people of color. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gloria. And Tyler, I think that you may be able to comment on this as well, but the Jim Crow laws and how these types of laws still affect communities of color today. You and I talked about this before.
Sure, yeah, and I'll briefly touch on that. And I think to add to what everyone has said, the Jim Crow laws, there's this brief period of Reconstruction within the U.S. South, and referring back to South Carolina as kind of a reference point, there was a fear among the white population throughout the South, but specifically in states that had large Black populations, of political power. And this is when you start to see the development of vigilante organizations like the Ku Klux Klan that does reflect aspects of the slave patrols among marginalized white men who have this innate fear of competition now that you have newly freed people who could compete for jobs. But after Reconstruction fails, and it fails largely because of a craven federal government that betrays it, but that's maybe a subject for another day, you have the institution of Jim Crow laws, and expressly by 1890 is when a lot of historians start to see a definitive shift in the legal codes and legislation. And the 1890s are important, particularly for Plessy versus Ferguson, as basically the dismantling of any attempt by the federal or the allowance of state governments to disrespect the rights of Black populations. And the Jim Crow laws, broadly conceived, once again, can be based state by state. But the commonality of the experience is that many of the laws were instituted, once again, echoing reflections of slavery and its legacies as a way to marginalize and contain Black people to plantations. So Black people were not legally designated as enslaved, but they certainly were contained upon plantations, and laws such as vagrancy laws or perceived drunkenness laws, or traveling, once again, perhaps without permission after hours, curfew laws, were instituted specifically to prey upon Black people. And when we talk about the rise of mass incarceration, it doesn't rise to the extent that we know of in the 1980s, but you start to see the effects of it in the early 20th century in particular, as more and more Black men are arrested under spurious charges and sent either to a penitentiary or to a convict leasing system. And so the dismantling of the Black family, the rise of mass incarceration, and the unequal laws that are written into the states, not just in the South, but also throughout the North as well and into the West, Las Vegas being actually a good example of unequal laws that were used under Jim Crow-style racism in this particular location, is where you start to see how America has a pre-established method of subordinating the Black population, despite the fact that there were civil rights acts passed in the mid-1860s that were supposed to guarantee equal treatment under the law for people of African descent. But essentially under Plessy versus Ferguson and the transferal of power to the state governments, that were now based upon white supremacy in the late 19th century and throughout most of the 20th century is when you start to see the states' rights argument overtake federal protections that were supposed to be guaranteed for black people. So the Jim Crow laws certainly set up a standard under which black people's rights are not guaranteed to be respected by the nation state.
Tyler,
May I add one point?
Yes, of course.
If you don't mind? Okay, I can't see, so I don't know what, if that was a good jumping off point. I'm so glad that Plessy versus Ferguson is the cornerstone of this conversation because it's 1896. We have to understand that the African American has made great strides. When slavery ended in 1865, you had laws prior to that said that black people were not allowed to read and write, and who were enslaved. Now you have this very high illiteracy rate. 1870, black men have gained the right to vote. So this is the 150th anniversary of the black male gaining the right to vote, in addition to the 100th anniversary of women gaining the right to vote. There were black US senators. And so going back to this point, to this political power and the backlash, the creation of the Ku Klux Klan, there were black US senators, there were black US congresspeople. It's been said that there were over 4,000 black men in local and federal government. And then you also had the creation of schools and colleges. By 1872, there are black female attorneys. There are colleges that are creating wealth. And as the rise, then triggers, as was pointed out, the federal government's concerned that they're going to politically lose the Southern vote in an election. They then decide to end that South. So when Plessy versus Ferguson, these segregationist laws come in, they're called Jim Crow laws, but they're segregationist laws. And this is one example I want to give around this political power that black people had. These black men had enough political power to be massacred in the Colfax massacre in Louisiana in, I believe, 1873. And that massacre went unchallenged. This then dovetails into the criminal justice system. They are not being protected by the laws. They're not being protected by prosecutors, and they're pretty much on their own, even though there are federal civil rights laws that are supposed to protect them. These challenges go up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court supports the release of the murderers of black people. And it's very rare, it happens on occasion, but not often enough, that the Supreme Court actually supports the civil rights acts that have taken place in the 1860s into the early 1870s. In 1890, the Mississippi Plan starts the literacy tests, the poll taxes, and the other types of voter suppression that will be known for the next 100 years. So by the time we get to 1896 in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, for example, in Louisiana, there are over 100,000 black men registered to vote. Once that case institutes segregation around the country in every form and every aspect of social interaction, by 1900 in Louisiana, the number of registered black male voters has dropped from over 100,000 to 5,000. Now we also have the trigger of lynching. And the lynching is a heinous murder meant to send a message to the black community that they are powerless. And so the lynchings take place time and time again, thousands in American history. And they say too, it could be over 5,000 lynchings. Once again, no police protection, no prosecutorial protection, no court protection, no protection of politicians. And so as we go up through this time period, some of the vestiges that we see is a lack of protection that wasn't there before, and that lack of protection continues to be in question even as we go into the cases we see before us on television.
Gloria, thank you. The war on drugs caused a huge spike in the prison population, as Tyler mentioned, and an increase in racial disparity, of course. Greg McCurdy, how did these initiatives affect the police community relationships between people of color and police?
They obviously had a negative impact. And not only did they have a negative impact between the police and the community, but what it did to our families when we had that taking place. And I remember some of the things that were, how people were being treated with the war on drugs. And there were so many petty arrests that I remember being around when I was a police officer out in the streets, and I wasn't in the streets a lot, but the time I was out there, you could tell that people were really just racking up stats and doing what they thought was the mission. But when I look and listen to the historians speak about it, it wasn't much different than some of the things that they've communicated. I mean, when in both Tyler and Gloria put it very succinctly, and Clay T added a great perspective. So when you look at the war on drugs, it was just a negative time period. And then when I look at the war on drugs then, and then I look at the war on opioids, it's fought differently. One is fought with arrest, and another one is fought with Narcan. So it's interesting that when you look at the war on drugs, when you talk about it in the perspective in which I saw it, it started with marijuana, then PCP came, then came crack cocaine, and you didn't have the same level of fight on those who had the powder cocaine throughout the country, again, because they were treated differently in the system. So when you look at it, we have to look at not just the police interaction and what the police role was, but we have to look at the prosecutorial role, we have to look at the court's role, and it was so akin to slavery because we all know that labor was also needed within the prison system. There were certain jobs that needed to be done, whether it was the late 80s or the 90s or even today. There are still jobs that are done in our prison system while at the same time we have so many families who don't have a father figure, and then we hear the criticism of the black family. Well, you have to look at the root cause of some of it. And much of what we've all mentioned is a part of it. And the war on drugs will forever be that time period, a couple different time periods, where we certainly attribute it to the erosion of that family unit.
Clady?
So I wanted to add that we skipped from about 1890-something to the 1980s. So I want to just talk about Jim Crow, and to bring you right here to Las Vegas, I want to talk about what Jim Crow looked like in Las Vegas from 1905, really starting about 1930, the building of the Hoover Dam. We see what Jim Crow looks like right here in our hometown, right here in the town that we all love. So it meant that when the Boulder Dam was constructed in 1931, when this building that we're sitting in was constructed at the same time, we're sitting in the building that was on the property where a lot of African Americans lived. So African Americans had to move out of this area and move across the tracks. So that just gives you a look at what happened and what Jim Crow looks like. So during that era, racism begins to harden right here in our city because jobs were needed by white people. So those jobs on the Hoover Dam were sought after by everyone. It was the Great Depression. So people moved into this area from everywhere to get those jobs. They camped out for a couple of years. Those jobs were needed so badly. So the first round of hiring, they hired about 2,000 white men, and no black men were hired. And we had come here to get those jobs as well. So the NAACP began to work on the problem. Newspapers began to work on the problem. We see activity from the NAACP as far back as New York working on that problem. Out of all 20,000 men who worked on the Hoover Dam from 1931 to about 1935, or however many years, 20,000 workers, 44 blacks were hired. And the federal government built a town for the workers. They built Boulder Dam. Boulder City. African Americans could not live in Boulder City. And they said that one of the reasons that they didn't want to integrate the workforce is because you would have to have separate facilities constructed so black men could work there. So it just gives you a little look at what it was like. And then the tourist industry starts because of Boulder Dam, and now we get the casino industry, and entertainers start coming here. Well, blacks can't go into the front door of the hotel casinos. They can only go in the back to clean or to entertain. You have to stay at a boarding house across the tracks. So that kind of history shows you how Jim Crow evolved and what it looked like right here in Las Vegas.
So I'm gonna take it a step further. So then you move into the 40s, right?
Yes.
And then in the 40s, it's not until 1946 that the first black police officer of record was even hired by the old City of Las Vegas Police Department. And the interesting thing about him, he's still alive today, I might add. I think his 96th birthday is tomorrow, Thursday. But nevertheless, he could not even go into the police station, which was across the street, on the same side of the street, to go brief with the other police officers. He could not arrest white people in Las Vegas. He did his policing, which is now that new development across the tracks. They used him to keep peace with black people because he was a good-looking, just got out of the U.S. Navy after fighting in World War II, and he presented very well. He had a very strong voice, still has a strong voice, last time I talked to him. And that shows you where we were at, to Clay T's point about Las Vegas. And as Clay T was about to go on, I know it's not a history class, but I'm enjoying it personally. I know we're talking about policing and races, you know, race relations, but racism as well. Because racism is why these things were also occurring. And when you start to talk about racism and oppression, the police were used in all of that. And when you think about, even today, I can tell you as I look at the diversity of police departments in America, in most cities, it's lacking diversity, and it's lacking even more. And I can speak about it because I worked in the personnel office at the police department on 2 tours of duty. One was 1985 to 1987. That was after Metro was sued and lost the lawsuit with the Department of Justice that was filed by the Black Police Association, and it dealt with hiring, recruitment, and promotional opportunities in the police department. And some of that came about, you know, before that lawsuit was filed. And I'm gonna give you another little walk down memory lane or a little history. But one of the first blacks to ever get promoted to the rank of captain had to really battle the system to the point of had to file a lawsuit because he was denied the promotional under the allegation of cheating. When all the time others would be given the answers to the questions before there was a process put in place so to make it more fair and equitable. That person, that captain, won the lawsuit, was eventually promoted, and is the only person today that we have a police substation named in his honor, and it's Larry C. Bolden, and it's the Bolden Area Command. He was a man of honor. The other gentleman that I spoke about is Herman Moody. Herman Moody, he never made it to the rank of sergeant, lieutenant, or captain. He was recognized as one of the great detectives in this community. He saw more crimes because of the way he talked to people in the community, interacted with them, and got them to give him information. Same thing with Chief Bolden. I can name all of the ones who led at higher levels on this police department since the history of the police department in 1946. It turned to Metro in 1973. So when I look at where we have to go in policing, we still have a long way to go, even at Metro. We do not have the diversity in Metro that it should have to police a community that is as diverse as it is today. These are not conversations I've had in talking to friends. I've talked about it with police leaders. I still talk about it because us, all have a responsibility to encourage young men and women of all races to become police officers. The more diversity you have in the police department, the better suited a community is. It will bring about understanding. Not that others can't learn the community, but when you take people who come in from all throughout the country, some who've never been exposed to black people or Hispanic people or Asians, in many cases, because I've talked to them. First time I really got to know a black person was they moved to Las Vegas to become a police officer. That is kind of difficult. Some have managed to do quite well because not all of the men and women who are working as police officers are racist. There are a lot of good people, but there are a lot of racists, and we need to deal with them. We cannot paint police with a broad brush and make it a very, very less attractive role in our community. Policing is important to maintain order, to maintain peace. And I don't say law and order because I don't like the connotation that comes with law and order. The police must work with the people because we are the people. I grew up in West Las Vegas, no different than anyone else. I just happened to want to go in policing. And I found that I was a benefit, if nothing else. When I was in the room and when I was on the call, certain things would not occur. We make a difference, sometimes by mere presence, as a black police officer or Hispanic or female. Some of our best police officers were females. That's why we need more females. The way I've seen female police officers work and interact with the public is special. And we don't need to just have people who are big and brown. We need some. We need some, to be in SWAT and those different units. But not everybody in SWAT has to have a warrior mentality. We talked about the warrior mentality here a month or so ago. We don't need that anymore. We're not at war on the streets of our communities. We're people trying to make a living. People are trying to put a roof over their head, just trying to put food on their table and live a good life. That's what people want. So we got to continue to work towards that, because what we have now is just not working. The divisiveness that we have in this country from the very top levels of our government, it sucks. And I hate to use this language knowing the people I know are watching this, but that's the truth. We need to really think about what our role is individually as we continue to move on through the rest of this year and November comes. Whatever your flavor is, think about it, because we need a lot of help in our country. We are becoming a laughingstock of the world, and we are a country with democracy, the best economic structure, and yet we are not prospering for all people the way we should. Now, I may have gotten off topic a little bit, but that's what I was feeling right then, so I'll just yield it at this point.
Greg, thank you. It's difficult to track the data surrounding race in policing because many times it goes unreported. For example, there is still no federal database actually tracking use of force incidents. However, we do know that Black people are disproportionately targeted by the police in stops, arrests, and use of force. The data is included on the Fatal Force Project as well as the National Violent Death Reporting System. So this all comes full circle. When we think back to the history of policing, and Gloria mentioned this, the authorities didn't punish murderers when African Americans were lynched. The judicial system doesn't hold the police accountable for failing to intervene when Black people were murdered. So Gloria, I'd like to bring you back in here. You mentioned before when you and I spoke that because of this, George Floyd was a trigger. It has always been about a lack of accountability and a legacy of inequality in the judicial system.
Yes, and I'm glad we had the talk that we gave up to this point has included diversity of perspectives, because we have to look at it this way. How we built into the system a criminal injustice to people of color that has gone back 400 years. And the sense that we have not, as a society, done any to actually cleanse the system is a race-based component. So when we talked about whether or not it's the Bulls or the bounty hunters, the militia formed to put down Native American uprisings, all of these different mechanisms, and then we throw in the bobbies from England, and it becomes these jurisdictions around the country, 18,000 jurisdictions around the country with different types of police forces. However, the prosecutor's office and the police department work hand in glove. Prosecutors don't go out and investigate, the police do. Prosecutors are not the ones who are going to analyze the angle of a bullet or what type of wound that the person succumbed to. The police do that, and people who work within the police department. And so it's very difficult to take that same prosecutor who's been working hand in glove with a police officer and then have that police officer become a defendant. So the same prosecutor who, through the grand jury system, can go into a grand jury proceeding and get an indictment in a civilian upon civilian murder or assault, seems to become incompetent when that person is a defendant police officer they have worked with in the past. And so there have probably been, in their history of this country, perhaps 35 cases that have fully gone to trial of police officers who have been indicted and tried. And the number of police officers actually convicted is very small. So when we get to George Floyd, we have Officer Derek Chauvin, who in broad daylight, with people still watching, someone videotaping, has his knee on George Floyd's neck as he cries out that he cannot breathe. And he does this and puts his hand in his pocket as though this is the most casual thing in the world. He has 3 other officers with him. One of those officers had only been out of the academy for 48 hours. So Officer Chauvin is basically training those other 3 officers on how to terrorize the Black community. They chose George Floyd. They terrorized him in what is now considered a modern day lynching, because the lynching is a heinous death that is meant to send a message to the rest of the community. And remember, he's being videotaped. That's how we're able to watch a videotape, and he knew it. The person standing right in front of him. There were probably a dozen people watching this whole incident. So you would think it might be pretty simple to have a case against those 4 officers, especially Officer Chauvin. Not so fast. Because under the law, it's a standard of reasonable force. And what type of reasonable force is necessary is the type of force that an officer believes is necessary to keep the public safe and to keep that officer safe. And unfortunately, deadly force is not supposed to be used as far as unless the officer is facing deadly force. However, it says, I fear for my life. And the prosecutor, and Prosecutor Friedman in this particular case in Minneapolis, had said that initially George Floyd died of natural causes. It wasn't until the protests and the video coming out that they then saw what all of us have seen since then, that George Floyd was actually murdered. Now, whether or not that will be a crime that is punishable will be up to a system that has decided that officers have a lot of flexibility in defending themselves and the public. On the other hand, we have a civil part. So that's prosecution of deadly force and the use of deadly force and when deadly force should be used, or the type of force that's reasonable under the circumstances. On the other side, you have the civil action, which is qualified immunity. And qualified immunity is when you see a case that's brought by the estate of the family, and they're saying that this officer should not have done, or acted beyond a reasonable way in which an officer is supposed to act, but that action should be qualified in a way that officers, their hands tied, if they were always fearful of being arrested, they were fearful of a money judgment against them in a civil rights action, then an officer would not be able to do their jobs. So we have to balance out when an officer's behavior goes too far and in which instances. And I want to quickly give you these stats. 1, over 1,000 civilians are dying at the hands of police every year. This is what they've actually come to grips with. They didn't have the data, as Shakayla said, prior to this. The FBI wasn't keeping it. And it took the media to actually find out how many people were being killed generally. And then they find that on average, they've been keeping these stats since 2013. Over 1,000 civilians die at the hands of police every year. Now remember, we've only had about 35 trials, and of those trials, we've had very few who have actually been convicted and had to serve time. At this point, I think the other aspect of this is women are dying too. And there was a recent Washington Post article on the fact that over 200 women have been killed by police in the last 5 years. So when we start thinking about a number of people dying by police, it's not just Black people, There are white people, and I want to give you these two very quick scenarios you're all familiar with. Remember the Boston bomber, the man who, with his brother, set the bombs that killed so many people in Boston and wounded so many others? The police tracked him down. They found he was hiding. They talked him out of his house. He would stand trial. I want you to think about Eric Frame of Pennsylvania and those two, the man and woman in Las Vegas, who execution style killed police officer. Remember, these are not people who were gunned down by the police. If they didn't take their own lives, then they were taken in to stand trial. So what we're having is a Black person time and time again gunned down by the police, unarmed, or even with the case of Philando Castile, he's saying to the officer, I have a permit for this gun. Let me reach for it. So when you have these carry states, yes, you can carry a weapon, but why is it that white people can carry a weapon, but when a Black person is carrying a weapon as well, they're seen as dangerous? We had white people converge on state capitals, and on those state capitals with loaded weapons, complaining about the fact they had to wear a mask. Not one single arrest, of course, and no shooting. And then we also have a white young man who opens fire, an AK-13 rifle strapped across the front of his chest. There is video of this. After he has opened fire, he holds up his hands and walks to the police. The police are in their cars. They let him walk by and then turn and go arrest the Black people he shot. This is what's taking place in America, and the standards that we have under law make it so that police officers like Derek Chauvin can put their hand in their pocket in broad daylight, take a life, and I'm telling you at this point, and I've been told about this, people are saying, I'd rather have an off stopped ahead of time rather than have their son die and have to wait for a qualified immunity standard to be applied, right, hearing afterwards where money damages are paid. Do you want your child alive, or do you want a check? And those are the questions now that many Black parents and family members are being presented with, given the legal standards that we have. Unless criminal justice reform includes reforming the prosecutor's office, we're not going to have the type of changes that our officer has talked about today.
Gloria, thank you. Tyler?
Yeah, I'll just briefly add to that. One thing that comes to mind is there was a case in Salt Lake City that happened probably about a month ago, or at least it was reported about a month ago. And it goes in a slightly different direction in that the excessive force that's utilized by police can also involve other species, so namely the canine unit being one of the worst perpetuators of this problem. And the case in Salt Lake City was essentially a man got into an argument with his wife. He was a Black man. The police were called. And the video shows, it took a while for it to get released, but the video shows that as he put his hands up and got on his knees, they sicked the dog on him anyway. And kind of this really ritualistic framework of torture and intimidation and excessive force. And if you look at the forensics evidence of how canine bites from police dogs play out for people, is that they are far more lethal than a typical domestic dog bite. And one of the reasons is because these dogs are military grade. I mean, it is not by accident that the German Shepherd was chosen, and there's a long history of this as to how this comes to fruition in the 1950s. But a lot of this reminds me of how the police, particularly with the canine unit, come prepared to use the dog preemptively as a way to intimidate and bring down the victim of the dog bite when they have shown nothing to perpetuate that action. And if you look at even the Department of Justice report in Ferguson, Missouri, that was released after protests through Black Lives Matter, one thing that the Department of Justice found is that if you look at the use of canines, they were used against only black men, and some as young as 12 years old. And all that these individuals were doing were hiding in a closet, and the dog was used to drag them out. But the Department of Justice concluded that the dog was not a necessity. It was not necessary to be used, that the police were using it as a tool of violence and intimidation and terror. And there's a long history as to how this reflects the era of slavery from colonization to the present that I don't have time to get into. But one thing that I was thinking about as everyone else has been speaking is that we also have to consider the non-human elements of policing and that problematic history and its links to the past and the antebellum period as well.
Tyler, thank you. So when thinking about the last topic that we should address in this discussion, I thought it was necessary that we touch upon the stereotypes and the dehumanization of Black people over the years, and we've done that. We've touched upon it within the past 45 minutes or so. But Tyler, you and I actually spoke about this, but how this has led to a physical and psychological damage within communities of color. Can you please explain how?
Sure. I mean, I think that with the building of the carceral system, in that there's a certain irony, perhaps, that it's called the Department of Corrections or Rehabilitation, in that what seems to occur is first, the police comes as a unit that is ready to arrest. And you can see this in particular in Las Vegas, and Clay T, I think, can speak to this even more, in the 80s and the 90s as the police are using excessive force and they are invading communities and arresting people upon spurious charges. And so first you have an interaction with a state arm that you don't trust because you've seen how it's devastated your own community, and then they place you essentially within buildings with cages as a way to further dehumanize you. So you could be innocent, or you could be arrested for a very petty drug crime, given a disproportionate sentence, and essentially spend much of your time, or much of your youth even, locked behind bars and told that you are nothing day in and day out. And then they release you with perhaps pennies in your pocket and tell you to reintegrate into a society that has determined that as an ex-convict, you have no place in society anymore. So what we have done is we have allowed people to be convinced that the carceral system, the system of incarceration as it's established, is somehow rehabilitating people, and if there's recidivism rates, if they go back, somehow that's their fault, that they just need to deal with it. But what we've done, and Michelle Alexander writes about this in the new Jim Crow, I'm not saying anything new here, but we have established a system that does reflect similar legal codes, hearkening back to the Black codes and the Jim Crow era, to where if you have anything on your record, in many states you can't vote, people will overlook your application. You essentially have no way to reintegrate into society as a citizen that can contribute to that society. And I'll let others weigh in on that, but that is my initial thoughts on it.
So quickly, even though systemic racism goes throughout the criminal justice system, starting with arrest and bail and probation and parole and sentencing and the court system, the entire gamut is a system of systemic racism. I still regret that we started using the phrase defunding the police. Yes, police officers have not been trained. They don't know any history. They don't know how to act. And yes, retraining needs to happen. Still, we need the police. And I say that, I don't say that lightly, because sometimes I'm afraid of the police. I have gray hair, and still sometimes there's fear. But we need other services. And I think this is what we should have explained better when we started talking about defunding the police. So we need police. We need them to police in different ways. There needs to be more community policing. At one time, we tried that here in Las Vegas, and it worked for a while, but we grew out of it because not enough police officers were being trained in the right way. So I just like to know that everybody to know that I'm not really here tonight to beat up on the police. That's not my goal. I am here to end systemic racism. And the police department, the criminal justice system is filled with systemic racism. It needs to change.
You know, I'd just like to add a little bit to that, because when I look at what you just said, well said, because I totally agree with you on the terminology that was used. Police started doing jobs that they, again, weren't trained, that were highly specialized needs when dealing with people with mental illness, as an example, people who are suffering from homelessness, because people have a mistaken look on what homelessness is. Sometimes they're just people who lost their jobs, as we are going to probably see more homelessness very soon with all our friends and neighbors who've lost their jobs in our community. But what I want to just touch on real quick, when you look at the amount of money being paid out by insurance companies and cities and counties and states on police misbehavior, if you were to look at that money that we, in some regards, contribute to through paying taxes, and we would look at holding people in the police profession more accountable and in the prosecutorial more accountable, because when you start to look at, and we've not talked about the Innocence Project or any of those other projects where there's even more millions of dollars that have been spent on people who went to prison, falsely accused, coerced confessions, didn't have the proper physical evidence and all those things that ends up freeing them. That money that we're talking about could easily have funded many of the programs that people are really thinking about when they're talking about defund the police. But here's what we have to demand as communities. We have to demand of our police departments to recognize the sanctity of life, which Metro has it in the policy. It's good to have in the policy, but we must talk about it constantly. We must talk about what it is to slow the action. The new terminology is de-escalation, but really police have to stop, think, and look at alternatives, slow down, not rush in, because we're talking about people's lives, and people, when they're under stress and distress, they're not thinking clearly. And those are the people that police are called to, their homes. And a lot of times the information that's given to the police dispatcher and how it's relayed sometimes is not as accurate as people want to think it is. So I know when I used to talk to my police officers when I was leading, is that you take that information to get you there, but you go with an open mind on how to deal with a situation. Go in an open mind that you're dealing with people who are probably at their worst moments, who never really needed to see a police officer. Just like in a car stop, it still scares me too. I don't want to be stopped by the police.
Yes.
Because I don't want to get a young police officer to say something that's going to, cause me to get upset. After having served 30 years, I don't want to tolerate that. So I just try to slow down. Constantly being reminded to slow down and do right, because it's sad that we have to not feel that that's going to be a good interaction. But I have been stopped, and it wasn't a good interaction by the police department that I worked with. Okay, so these are real problems. So I think the history is great. I really appreciate the perspectives, because I think that's sometimes what we miss. And Clay D said it a different way. Maybe police training needs to take a step back. Maybe some of the training does need to touch upon some of these topics.
Yes.
So how do we do that when the police are only given, police departments, Metro's given 20-some weeks, I've lost track of how many, but the other comment, you made 18,000 police departments in America. Most of them are 100 or less police departments. Most of them don't have a training academy. Most of them have no business being police departments, because they really don't have the support and the infrastructure to be effective modern-day police departments. So there's a lot of topics that we can get into here when we start to talk about policing in America, the history of policing, and where we need to go. But it's people who are like the ones in the audience, the ones who are probably, weighing in on live stream and being active participants. You got to make your voices heard. And we don't have to scream, we don't have to holler. I know I get a little excited and emotional because I really want to see things better with policing and the relationships with communities. And I don't think we need programs called community policing. I think we need police officers doing what they are supposed to do in the community in which they live, shop, eat, and go to church or whatever. They need to just treat people with respect, okay? Because that's what people want. But on the flip side, people in the community also need to treat one another with respect and be mindful that the police have a difficult job to do, especially today. So we all know we need the police, but we got to hold them accountable. So those are some of the other topics of great discussion. And, you know, police unions. I mean, when we start to talk about all of this history, where did police unions come in? Police unions were great for their intended purposes years ago, and that was to negotiate better salary, benefits, and working conditions and equipment for police officers. But now it's become a political power base, and that political power base is influencing, or in many cases, stopping change from occurring. There are great police chiefs that we are losing almost daily in America who want to do the right thing, but they can no longer fight the unions. Then add to that the perceptions of communities and the pressure now. That's not good for the communities of America, not good for the profession, because these were people who were trying to look at such things as early warning systems so that the Derek Chauvins with 19 sustained complaints would no longer be out there policing. Now, Metro has a really good system, but even with good systems, there are people who are going to get through the cracks, and we all know that. But you and anyone you know, who's viewing live stream, we just have to continue to have very, very significant conversations, and we have to continue to hold elected officials accountable. You know, they look for endorsements, and guess what endorsement is? A coveted endorsement. Yes. It's police union. Yes. So there's a lot of work we have to do.
Greg, thank you. Gloria, did you want to say anything?
Yes, I wanted to add just to all the brilliant comments that have been made to this point. I want to go back to something else, and it's not just the prison that is demoralizing. There are millions upon millions of people being demoralized by stop and frisk, and the humiliation of being stopped by police, not having any control over their bodies. I want you to think about one of the most vulnerable things you can do is turn your back on a stranger, and especially a stranger with a gun. And we are being told to get out of our cars, turn our backs on a stranger, spread our legs, and let this stranger then run their hands up and down our bodies. This power was given to police officers in 1963 with the Terry versus Ohio case. And it was meant to be a case in which someone who is an officer is supposed to see if a person has a weapon. It's been turned into a mechanism of humiliation, of dehumanization. It's turned into a mechanism of power in which you have police officers training little black kids and brown kids and other poor whites. Who's the boss? Who's in control? As early as 9 and 10 years old, you have people putting themselves face down on a filthy ground at the order of a police officer. In many of these cases, and some of them you see, an officer is saying, with a gun, you do as I say, and now the message has been sent that your life could be taken. If that officer says, I feared for my life because this person didn't get down on the ground when I told them to. And then you're supposed to lie down on that ground and stay there in the rain, the cold, the filth, and everywhere else until that officer says you're able to get up. Then you're handcuffed and booked. And then later on, the charges could be dropped. Ask if you say something. So the mechanism of stop and frisk has been so widely abused, and now we know it as racial profiling, not just in cars, but on the streets. So you see driving while black, walking while black, having a barbecue while black, going to the swimming pool while black. And then, of course, people have been familiar with what happened in Central Park with the Central Park case. You have people calling police. It's against the law to call the police, to use the police officer or any government facility or government agency for discriminatory purposes. That was the Supreme Court decision over 100 years ago, that you couldn't use a government to discriminate against someone based on race. And yet we see people making these calls all the time just to harass, and police officers are then being called in And then next thing you know, something could actually escalate into a life being taken. So as was pointed out, many of us want to call the police. I know I haven't, because I don't know which officer is going to show up. Is it going to be officer friendly or officer deadly? I have no idea. Because of that concern, there have been times when, as a taxpayer, I should be able to call the police, and I haven't been able to because out of that fear and concern. Want to go back to what was said by Tyler early on, and that this goes full circle. It's all about competition. It's about eliminating the Black competition. And after Barack Obama's 2 terms in office, you see an uptick in the number of Black people who are killed by police. There are many, many people in policing who are great, and there are some rogue police officers horrible, and they need to be in prison. And without them going to prison, I give this example, when you go home tonight and you're driving, you stop at the stoplight because there are consequences. You might hurt somebody, you might cause a car accident, but also you know the possibility of having a criminal infraction. If there is no possibility of criminal consequences for killing over 1,000 people a year, how are you going to stop from killing? And the police department, as you said by the union, is such a tight unit. This wall of, there are people within police departments who are afraid of these rogue police officers. They are afraid of them themselves. So there were people probably afraid of Derek Chauvin. It wasn't that the police officers didn't know, but they pulled on him. And so that undermines the trust that we're supposed to have in our police department. And I think that has been broken. Hopefully it can be rebuilt, some reform of policing.
Okay, Gloria, thank you. And so I know this conversation has been heavy because it's been heavy for me too. And we know that it won't be writing Black Lives Matter on a basketball court that eradicates the social inequalities and injustice in our country. So how do we begin to improve this unbalanced police-community relationship? Anyone can chime in here.
I'll start. We just have to be active participants. The police and the community is one and the same. Have to interact, have to, I said earlier, you also have to interact with the prosecutorial leadership in our community. They have a lot of leeway. I was talking to a former prosecutor out of New York, ironically, and through that person's entire career, they never had any implicit or explicit bias training. It wasn't until they went to the private sector and the company, had them go through it. Now, you would think that, if police departments had to go through it, why wouldn't prosecutors have to go through it? Because they have a lot of biases that could actually be as detrimental to the prosecution of a person than the police who have prepared the arrest report, okay? So in our communities, we need to have these conversations. When there's time to elect a district attorney, city attorneys are appointed, so you don't have really much of a say there. But when there's time to, elect your local Clark County district attorney, you need to find out who that person really is and what they're about. And we need to start questioning them about how they would run an office and what would be expected of a prosecutor. We missed a lot of opportunity on the judges here recently. We had a lot of good judges who did not make it past the primaries that were a lot of good public defenders after you start to read more and more about them. We got to take time, we have to do our homework when we are going to ballot boxes to know. And it's difficult now because, depending on what your, social media platform or what you read, you're not always getting unfiltered factual information. So my advice to you on that is try to read multiple sources. I'm always fact-checked at home and say, hey, where'd you get that from? And I appreciate it. It makes me, go deeper and read more because you need balance of the different outlets that we receive information, or else you're going to be skewed one way or the other, which sometimes is very, very dangerous, especially right now.
So I don't know what the solution is. I know that something has to happen. It has to change. I think it is really important that we get to know each other, that police officers, people in all the systems that have to do with the court system, we all should get to know these people. And Greg is right. We need to do our research before we go to the polling place. Yes, we can vote down one side of the ballot, but when it comes to judges, we don't know how to vote. When it comes to the person in the district attorney's office, we don't know what he is like. So we just have to study, and we have to do better. There has to be something done with those people, though, that are on the streets with us every day, that are controlling our behavior. Those people have to be taught in a different way. I don't know what that different way is. I don't know how to train police officers. I know that they are not being trained correctly. I don't know what the correct way is. I know that they don't know any history, and they need to learn history. And I'm not just talking about only white police officers learning history. None of us know enough history. We don't know enough about what Tyler told us and what Gloria told us tonight. We have to learn that kind of history. We have to do better. We just have to do better. And we have to hire somebody who is going to be the one stopping us at midnight. We have to hire people who know how to treat us. I don't know who that is, but it has to reflect us better. We need police officers that when someone stops me, every once in a while, now I don't get stopped that often, okay? But I want somebody every once in a while who looks like me. I know that we have black police officers, but it just seems that everybody who's ever stopped me did not look like me. We have to hire and train and just do better.
So I'll be relatively brief because Greg and Clayton have really touched on things that I've been thinking about, and as a person outside the police force looking in, what it seems to me is going along with this idea of education is that there is a lack of an awareness in general amongst many officers throughout the United States of the fraught history of the police force and marginalized groups. And I say marginalized groups in its broadest category. And what that seems to translate into, if social media is any indicator, though I always hesitate to accept social media as reality sometimes, it does seem to me that every time a person levels a complaint against the police or the actions of police forces, police officers become very offended as if it's a personal attack against them. But what people are doing is they are asserting a critique of the institution, and they are often telling the truth about the institution. And I think if officers who join the force can accept that, learn the history, go through some form of training, in understanding that if you approach a person, say, of African descent as a white officer, you have to recognize how that interaction is going to be perceived by the person that you're stopping. And perhaps that awareness can at least facilitate a better mutual understanding between two people. And then when people level critiques against the police, it doesn't necessarily have to be an immediate rejection on the part of officers, but that they can take the critique by understanding the history and then use that as a reference point to try to improve relationships in the future. And so I don't think that's an indicator of something that's going to completely and totally adjust the system, but it is a step, I think, in people throughout the United States, but in reference specifically to police officers, of recognizing the history and how it continues to impact the present.
Thank you, Tyler. Gloria, did you want to say anything?
Yes. I'm going to first quote W.B. Du Bois. And W.B. Du Bois was a black PhD graduate from Harvard in the 1800s. And he said back then, and maybe this sounds familiar for today, a system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect. Our criminal justice system was never meant to protect Black and brown people. It was never meant for this. It was meant to protect white people from Black and brown people. We have kind of tried to work around the edges of this systemic monster called criminal justice as it's grown from 1865 as part of the 13th Amendment. And we have tried to add Black officers, we've tried to add Black prosecutors, but we've never reached the core of what this is. And it is an entity that was meant to create and maintain white superiority and to crush people of color. And as Tyler pointed out in the very beginning, it was meant to control Black and brown and other people of color. If we don't have deep conversations about this, that for first and foremost, then we are missing the point of criminal justice. And we have had these conversations about voting rights. That's why we had the 1965 Voting Rights Act. We've had these conversations about housing. We've had these conversations about a number of other areas, but we have not. We've had it about education with Brown versus Board of Education, but we've never had it about criminal justice. So now is the time to have it about criminal justice. That's my first point. My second point is there are rogue police officers who are white supremacists and intent on murder. They are going into these police departments and they have a white supremacist background, and no conversation and kumbaya holding hands is going to stop them from doing what they want to do. If we don't send a counter message that they will be prosecuted for taking lives and assaulting people of color with impunity, then they are not going to stop. And that's why this nation that claims it's a shining light on the hill of democracy is also the same nation that's taking 1,000 lives a year with impunity. And we're watching it on our cell phone cameras, and there's nothing that's being done to any real degree. Thirdly, we need to have a difference in our prosecutor's office. Yes, we can change the DA because they run for office, but those prosecutors, as was pointed out, those are government employees with a union, and they too are protecting themselves behind a wall of silence that's as deep as the wall of silence that we have in the police department. And so I say litigation, legislation, and protest are the three mechanisms that come together for social change. And we're going to have this criminal justice legislation, federal legislation that includes changes in the prosecutor's office and even a whistleblower in the prosecutor's office. We're going to have more litigation of these cases and not just have our tax money. In New York City, we spend $1 billion almost paying off civil cases based on law enforcement officers who are abusing the rights of civilians. And the last is protest, and I'm a believer in protest. And I want you to know, I teach at John Jay College. I teach constitutional law. I teach as a required class for police officers, for people who want to be police officers. And I still say, most people go into policing to help people. And I still say that, and I get criticized for it from people who are as activists just like myself. But I know it because I interact with them and I see it in their eyes, and I've talked to them enough, and I've been teaching for 20 years. So there are a lot of police officers on the forces around this country I've taught, but there are some bad apples in this group, and they're really out there for the kill. And if we don't speak to some type of legal changes that are going to address this, then we're continuing to be a nation watching over 1,000 people dying at the hands of police officers each year. And yet, at the same time, we want to say that we're proud of our country, but we can't be proud of this behavior. And now that we know about it, and we can't sit back to keep letting it happen.
Gloria, thank you. I did want to give a chance to some members in the audience. If you wanted to ask a question to any of our panelists, you're more than welcome to. And Jeff has the mic right over here. Right here, Jeff.
All right, there we go. We have time for just a few questions.
Hey, can you hear me, guys?
Yep.
Yeah, I was wondering, in terms of community, shouldn't it go down further down to like the families too? So like family values, like talking about the history. But if you have a really good family who understands the history of African Americans, and they can instill that onto their children, what are your feedbacks on that?
I think they do.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just briefly add, I mean, I think historical consciousness is a key aspect of it. And I mean, going even beyond family, community support as well. And I think that because, once again, the modern police unit, as we understand it, is a relatively recent phenomenon in U.S. history in particular. When you look at some of the old documents, community enforcement, community values, and family do replace the necessity of always involving a police unit in the neighborhood.
Yeah, another one over. Let me come over here and then we'll go there.
Can you hear me? I appreciate all you coming out to talk tonight. Learned a lot of things. I have a question, maybe to Greg McCurdy or to Professor or Gloria Brown-Marshall. When it comes to, when you talked about earlier about the mass criminalization and Jim Crow and then the mass incarceration, and one of the things that we always see, and I don't know why, and I'm just wondering, why do you think the FBI puts out these crime stats every year by race? It's like black, white, or other.
Gloria, you want to start since you probably teach that in your constitutional law class? I'll speak about it from a police perspective.
The reason why I ask is because I know, well, we can see by the way you're reporting the things he was saying by Jim Crow, you know, vagrancy and looking at a white woman and all these other crimes. We know they're slanted.
It's to
not
shape
accurate,
people's
but
opinions of us, right? It's to shape people's opinion and to make people fearful of black people. And it's a false, you know, accusation when you start to look at the way their crime statistics are reported, because another issue is that they're not captured the same way in every community. The definitions of crimes have always been suspect. We've had to deal with it at Metro. Crime may be defined one way in one community or one state and defined a different way. So then when you start to try to put that crime report that he's talking about, uniform crime reporting, statistical model has always been one with people who understand that it's fraught with what we would call significant stereotypes, painted perceptions, and to cause another form of division, to also go to what I think we're hearing goes to Jim Crow and supremacy. Now, I'll give it.
I'll just add that on the one hand, the reason why data is collected based on race is so that we have an idea of what's happening. I mean, data is collected based on race for education, for housing, for things, because this is a race-based country, and they need to know, based on the 1957 Civil Rights Act, how people are being treated across the board. What particular racial or race-based data is published, that's another story, because it's rare that, for example, back to what I was saying with Katie, we've had a systemic discrimination taking place on whether or not the person stopped by police will be actually arrested. So we have now a disproportionate number of people who are being stopped, people of color then arrested. And then once the person is arrested, you know, are they going to maintain those charges? Whether or not that person will be prosecuted? Will they be given a drug program if there's a drug-based incident, or will they be incarcerated? All of these things now are race-based. So you're going to have elevated numbers because policing is race-based in many ways, and so is prosecution and criminal justice. And then when the FBI decides they're going to publish particular stats, they usually try to publish the ones in which they have the highest number of people of color, in particular disproportionate to other people. But you also know to child molesters. You could have a much higher number of white male child molesters, but they're not showing that number. They're showing the number of other types of crime. So everything's got a human element, and human beings are deciding what numbers they're going to put forward, what numbers they're going to publish, and then, of course, how the public's perception of people based on their race is then affected by the publication of those numbers. But white on white crime is something no one talks about. Most people commit crimes within their racial or ethnic group. Go back to this idea of a family unit. Domestic violence is within that family unit as well. And so no one talks about white crime or Latino on Latino crime or Asian on Asian crime. No one talks about that. It's just as deadly as what we talk about is this made up fiction of such a thing as black on black crime alone.
We'll take this question, and then we have one from the live stream, and then we'll wrap it up.
This is for Sheriff. Several years ago, I know Metro had an issue with excessive use of force. They brought in an extensive training program, and you actually became quite a model for the United States in that program. What is the I'm sorry, this is driving me crazy. What is the status of that training? Is it still in effect? And basically, is it still in effect in the status of that program?
2012, the collaborative reform model was born. There was a program with the Department of Justice Community-Oriented Policing Services. We at Metro had recognized for years that we'd had a problem with deadly use of force, that we were killing people that we didn't need to kill. We were being justified, as the coroner's inquest process at the time would indicate, but we knew that we had to make a change. When we saw some of the excessive shootings where many, many rounds were fired very inaccurately, inappropriately, excessively, we wanted help. We went through that process. I retired in 2013. That process was still ongoing. It included policy changes. It included training. It included ongoing training. Even to this day, a new reality-based training facility is being planned. It's a continual conversation. It can't just be a program. It has to be institutionalized for change to occur. But just as important is that we really got to find the facts. So you have to do a really critical review. So there's a critical review portion of it as well. Now, the one challenge we have, once it goes from the internal process to the outside process, there's another process called, I think they call it fatal review, fatality review. The ironic thing about that is that the officers don't even have to show up to be questioned. So there's continual need to pay attention to these processes and what's implemented. And again, it's not just the police, it's a system. The entire system of accountability has to get in line to put people who are recklessly performing under the color of the law and killing people with bad intentions and bad behavior. There are times when police officers are going to have to take aggressive action to defend someone's life. We know that, and we expect that. But there are those times in which we've been speaking about that we need to continue to find ways to solve the problems that we're dealing with in our country.
Thank you. So there is one question from the live stream. I think it's maybe for Greg, maybe for Gloria as well. Is the easiest way to reduce crime, I'm just reading this, is the easiest way to reduce crime to change the definition of specific crimes? In other words, is there reform that we could see in this area that would help the situation?
That's interesting. You want to go, Gloria? Go ahead. Ladies first.
I'm just going to say this very quickly. Historically, and you know, there in Las Vegas, you had crimes being taken, through the mob museum. You had the Irish Mafia. You had the Italian Mafia. You had the Jewish Mafia. You had the gangs in New York City that were part of crime organizations. You also had the Black Mafia. Some of you may not know about Bumpy and the Black Mafia here in Harlem. What they did, especially in New York City and Chicago and other places, they instituted jobs programs so that people didn't have a choice, go to school. Somebody remember this? They instituted jobs programs for the Irish, for the Italians, for many people, and they realized that these jobs programs would take away the lure of crime. And so, yes, they did change the definitions of certain crimes so that they didn't have such high penalties for young people, and I know I have. I've done things when I was young, and I look at it now going, oh my goodness, I barely escaped, you know? But now today, everything they've made that young people are doing has such a high criminal consequence that I do think there should be some changes in the naming of crimes, but I also think that in many instances, people from the age of 16 to 28 have an almost 80% unemployment rate. So especially during the summer, if they don't have jobs, you know, young people are going to get in trouble. If they don't have like a community center to learn things, they can play sports, then they're going to get in trouble. And so it's a matter of changing some of the consequences for some of these jobs, some of these crimes, to increase jobs, job training, and give people things to do. And that's not happening in the Black communities the way it happened in the Irish and others back when there were a lot of issues with gangs and other crimes.
Gloria, thank you.
I think she answered it fairly well.
Greg, thank you. And thank you all to our panelists for being here tonight, and you all as well, and for all those watching on our live stream too. Our next event will be held on October 14th. That is called the Push for Change, Legislative Pathways to Police Reform, and that is the third and final The Future of Policing program, but it won't be the last. We are committed to continuing this conversation with our community, and so in that program, we'll explore the legislative actions that are currently underway to address police use of force, and our panelists will include Attorney General Aaron Ford, Assemblyman Tom Roberts, former Tucson Police Chief Robert Villanueva, and the ACLU as well. Thank you all.